So let's talk about domain number 5 now. Identity and access management, or controlling access and managing identity. Now the key areas that we need to talk about, because we know the CIB's got some key areas that they're kind of helping us point us in the right direction. We're going to talk about controlling access to our assets, identification and authentication, an identity as a service, third-party identity services, authorization mechanisms, access control attacks, and managing the identity and access provisioning lifecycle. So we got a few things that we need to get in there and discuss. So let's start with controlling access and assets. Now when we talk about that, we need to make sure that we have that good foundation, right? So we've talked about the CIA triad before, or the ACI, or the ICA, or some people change it around so they don't get confused, right, with the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. That's why I always stick the word triad at the end instead of just saying, what does CIA mean? So the CIA triad when it comes to security. Let's do a little review. Confidentiality, integrity, availability. All right, we should have a pretty good handle on these now that you're at this point in your certification, going for CISSP. This should be pretty familiar with you. But confidentiality, prevent the unauthorized disclosure of information. We're trying to keep it secret, keep it private. So we're trying to prevent unauthorized read access to data. An example of confidentiality attack would be theft of your PII, that personally identifiable information, like credit card numbers, social security numbers, could be phone numbers, contact information, blood type, mother maiden name. That one might be a stretch. But things that pertain to you that can help identify who you are. All right, that's your PII. We want to keep that confidential. We want to keep it secret. We want to keep it private. Not everybody needs that information, right? It belongs to you or belongs to me. So that's my stuff, confidentiality. Integrity. Now we are trying to prevent the unauthorized modification of information. So there's security models out there that protect our information, right? The modification of that information. So in other words, integrity seeks to prevent unauthorized write access to data. So you can't write anything to this data. You can't modify it in any way. It doesn't have anything to do with reading it. That's confidentiality, because that's where we're trying to keep it private. Integrity seeks to stop or help prevent the unauthorized writing access to data. So we can't modify it. It's intact. It's the way it's supposed to be and how we intended it to be when somebody else gets it or how we received it. And then availability. Again, probably the easiest of the three. Information is going to be available when you need it. Is the data there? Are the services there? Systems need to be usable. They need to be available for normal business use, production use in your organization, in your small office, home office, in your huge corporate enterprise. However you want to look at it, you have to have that availability. So what is a very popular attack on availability? That's right, a DOS attack, a denial of service attack. What they're trying to do is flood you with information, right? Just tons and tons and tons of data. So you can't give, legitimate access, or I guess it's not you giving it, but you can't provide services because people can't reach you. The legitimate traffic can't come in because you're servicing all these other requests, or you're trying to service these other requests, but they're bogus requests. And your answers, your replies are not being received. So that's availability, right? We're trying to just make sure we're available to our customers 99.999% of the time, or 99.999% of the time, right? The 5 nines, the 6 nines, 3 nines, the 4 nines, whatever you have, whatever type of service level agreement you may have between you and your customers, or maybe you are the customer and a service provider. Now another one is called DAD, D-A-D. This is disclosure, alteration, and destruction. So this may be the complete opposite, the evil twin, if you will, of the CIA triad. It's because they are the opposites. Disclosure. This is the unauthorized disclosure of information. It would be the opposite of confidentiality. Alteration is the unauthorized modification of data. That would be the opposite of integrity, right? Because integrity is trying to keep people from changing that information. And destruction is making systems unavailable, which is a direct violation of availability. Availability is just that. We want things to be available to our customers, to our service provider, from our service providers. Destruction says we're going to make them unavailable. So the opposite is DAD. Disclosure, alteration, and destruction. Let's talk a little bit about identity and authentication, authorization, and accountability. So usually when you stick those three together, you get something that you call a AAA or an AAA service. So this is the cornerstone concepts of AAA: authentication, authorization, and accountability. Now, left out of the AAA acronym is one that we have to actually have beforehand. That's identifying, right? We have to be able to have identification before I can authenticate you. It's just plain and simple. I have to know who you are before I can authenticate who you are. So, but we usually just leave that out, right? Because that's kind of a given. Your identification. You put in your username. That's your identification. Your password is going to be the authentication. And then once they compare your identification with your authentication, you are now authorized to do something. So identity and authentication. Identity is a claim, all right? Saying I am somebody, right? I am David. That is me. But identity alone, I mean, it's only as good as my word, right? There's weak. It's weak. Could be considered weak. There's no proof. As far as you know, my name could be Jack or Sam or Billy. You're just taking my word for it. I walk up to somebody that doesn't know who I am, and I say, "Hi, my name is Steve. How you doing, Steve?" They don't know any different. They have to take my word for it, right? That is identity. Pretty weak because there's no proof. You can just say you are who you are. But proving an identity is authentication. So let's say I go to check in a hotel and I say, "Hey, I'm here, I have a reservation." And they say, "What's your last name?" And I drop a last name and they start to look and they say, "Oh yeah, we have you reserved in the presidential suite." You know, and I may have overheard that. But then the next thing they ask me for, they say, "Can we have some identification?" So I have to give them my ID, which now has my name and my face on it. So that's a form of authentication. They're going to look at it and say, "Oh, okay, yep, that's you. I'm authenticating you." Now, yeah, I know I could have a fake ID and blah, blah, blah. But in everyday terms, right, that would be authentication. So we authenticate the identity claim. As I say, I am who I am. Here's my driver's license that proves it. Now, we can also use like passwords, right? We use passwords. We use PIN numbers. There's a plethora of things that I'm trying not to give away right now because we're going to talk about them here in just a second. But passwords is very common. You sit down at a computer. You go to log in, you put in your username, your identity. I am Mark, right? So you just type in Mark. Your password, though, is what's going to authenticate you. It's going to prove to the authentication mechanism inside of your computer that you are who you say you are. Or you have somebody's identity and you compromise their password. That can happen too, right? People steal passwords all the time. We're going to talk about some of those attacks a little bit later. But that's authentication. What about authorization? Once you become identified and you are authenticated by the system. Now you are authorized to do something. Read, write, execute files or programs. So authorization describes the actions you can perform on a system once you've been identified and once you've been authenticated. So once they understand that, then, oh, okay, you have access. You are authorized to do this. Now, once we start authorizing people and they start doing their job or whatever it is that they're doing, we have to be able to hold them accountable. That's where accountability comes in. We hold them accountable for their actions on what they did or what they didn't do. Now, we typically accomplish this by logging and auditing data of what's going on our networks, on our servers, on our workstations, on our laptops. We have a trail, if you will, an electronic trail that we can go back and see what's going on. Now, it's not going to stop them. All right? It's more of a deterrent, I guess, for some, right? It's like locks on the door. Remember, I think I mentioned that locks keep, the honest people out. Well, accountability keeps the honest people honest. It's not a mechanism that we put in place like a technical control, like a firewall that's going to block traffic. Just being held accountable, some people may, I know they can see what I've done, but I don't care. Or maybe they're just not going to look, and I'm not going to worry about it. So if it's a dishonest person with malicious intent, again, accountability is not going to stop them. It may deter them a little bit, but we're going to use it as a detective tool later. So some more terminology that we need to know that I don't think we've covered up until this point. Non-repudiation means users cannot deny, they can't repute having performed, say, a particular transaction. Non-repudiation takes authentication and integrity. All right, combines those two together. Also, it authenticates that the identity of the user who performs a particular transaction, and it ensures the integrity of that transaction. That's why it can combine, or they say it combines authentication and integrity. Means we cannot deny. So, like if I digitally sign an email and I send it over to you, and later they're like, well, he sent me an email at 11 o'clock. I mean, no, I didn't. Be like, well, yeah, you did. You digitally, here it is right here. You digitally signed that. Because I might say, well, you can't prove that. It came from somebody else. Somebody spoofed my email, right? And you say, well, you digitally signed it here, so it looks like it's pretty legit. Digitally signing something gives that non-repudiation. I can't deny it now. And what about least privilege or need to know? We've talked about least privilege a little bit. Least privilege, we're granting them the minimum amount of access, a minimum amount of authorization, and just giving them enough to do what it is they need to do. Now, least privilege is applied to groups of objects, or it could be applied to groups of objects as well, instead of necessarily individuals. But we can say these objects need this permission level, and if you don't meet it, then you can't do that. So least privilege, giving them just enough to do their job. And then need to know, a little more granular than least privilege. Just because you may have a particular title and you have a particular rank or hierarchy in the company, least need to know, says, well, yes, I understand you run this department, but this is, you might hear, above your pay grade, right? This is need to know information. So the only people that need to see this or access this data is people that need this for their job. Need specifics for their job. That's what makes it a little more granular. Be like, well, I have least privilege. This covers this area, but this may be labeled as need to know. So just the people in that particular part of the department, that particular group, can access that data. Subjects and objects. We haven't talked about this one yet, but subject is an active entity on a data system. Now, most examples of subjects involve people accessing data files. They're going in and getting something out. Now, running computer programs can also be subjects because sometimes you have computer programs talking to other computer programs. Instead of just me sitting at the computer and accessing data, computer programs that we have on there can go get data as well, right? Call data and manipulate that data as well. So an object is any passive data within inside the system. Now, objects can range from databases to text files to audio, video, whatever it is that we want in there. They're passive within a system and they don't manipulate other objects. That's a subject. So subjects interact with the objects. And then defense in depth. I have mentioned this quite a few times. This applies multiple safeguards or those controls. Remember we talked about all those controls like firewalls, IDSs, IPSs, and the data is down here, right? We're trying to build layers upon layers before the attacker can actually get to the good stuff. Now, any single security control may fail along this way, but by deploying multiple ones, we're hoping to improve our confidentiality, our integrity, and availability of that data. Because we want different layers. If you break through one, maybe you won't get through the next one. You break through the next one, maybe I'll stop you on the next one. Hopefully I can prevent you from getting all the way to the data. Sometimes it happens though, right?